Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Margot and Eline, both President and Vice President of SELGRA. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and to give you some explanation about what currently is performed in terms of preparing astronauts for better flight and better mission to Mars. And I'd like to share my slides first. Hope it works well. I hope it works well for you, that you can see it.
Yeah, yes, please. Yeah.
So I will focus today on low gravity and radiation research, and then mainly I will say I will spend a little bit more time on radiation, because I think it's first it's quite an important asset for future mission, and maybe amongst the audience today there are some people who don't know that much about radiation and that would be interested in these topics. What I will cover today and what our kind of learning objectives for today is to understand the cosmic radiation sources, what are the typical doses of radiation and the dose rates that are encountered by astronauts. How does radiation interact, and cosmic radiation in particular, with materials in general? And then I will move also towards more the biological aspects and the medical aspects on how can radiation sensitivity varies between age, gender, and individuals, but also what is really in the pipeline in terms of understanding sensitivity, intrinsic radiation sensitivity between and amongst individuals and amongst astronauts. And then we will continue with the potential space radiation health risks. So we have already more than 60 years of space missions behind us, and data that have been collected that help us also to be able to figure out what will be the potential future risks for longer missions. So we started with the first orbit in 1961 with Yuri Gagarin of 1 hour and 40 minutes towards nowadays on the International Space Station missions that are typically around 6 months and above. So all through these 60 years, we gathered a lot of data and understood more and more what space flights and how important the impact of space flights are on the human body, and what are the consequences for the health and the behavior of astronauts, but also more importantly, how these effects can vary between astronauts. But we are preparing for longer missions to the moon, to Mars, longer missions than 6 months, and so these space missions will most probably affect even more crew health. And this is important to understand and to be able to extrapolate potential risks, but also to develop the necessary countermeasures to decrease as much as possible potential risks. The deep space getaway is really the next endeavor in front of us, which means first missions around the moon, on the moon surface, and later on Mars, towards Mars and on Mars surface. So this deep space getaway is really the first human space ship to explore the solar system. It's also for mankind that will provide the most distant human space missions ever attempted. And it's also the testing ground for all challenges of long duration human missions in deep space. And in these kind of contexts, microgravity or weightlessness are certainly will have a huge impact on human health and on crew health. But one of the main showstoppers next to it is radiation, and ionizing radiation in particular. Ionizing radiation in particular, is really amongst the most important stresses for long-term missions, as also pointed out by the Multilateral Human Research Panel for Exploration, which is a panel from the different international space agencies that in fact coordinate the efficient utilization of the ISS across international partners to help reduce human risks for exploration. So this panel has got a very important role in identifying and rating the various risks encountered, possible risks encountered by the crew. And as you can see, important to look at the risk ratings. And I would like, as you most probably know, musculoskeletal risks is certainly important to take into account, as well as sensory motor, as well as autonomous medical care or behavioral health and performance. We also, in this type of panel, is also mentioned the ocular syndrome, or everything related to nutrition in space, hypogravity, the dust exposure, as well as the environmental exposure. You can see that in the columns that the ISS risk and the lunar orbit are still reported as green colors, which means that they have like low or very low consequences, whilst when we move towards yellow and even towards red colors, the risks are even higher. And I would like you to focus on the last line on this table, which is addressing radiation in particular, with a higher risk of developing carcinogenesis, so developing cancer, but also other type of pathologies, as we will see in the next part of the presentation. So still on the ISS and lunar orbit, less than 30 days, this radiation risk is still kind of green, which is still kind of low or very low, with very low consequences. But the higher and the further away beyond low Earth orbit, this risk will become red, and certainly to go to Mars, the risk will have some high consequences, where it really needs and it requires mitigation, so countermeasures, development of countermeasures. So for a lot of the space research community, radiation is also considered as the #1 showstopper and the #1 risk to astronaut health beyond low Earth orbit. But what are we talking about when we speak about radiation, and what are the cosmic radiation sources? I just would like to briefly explain and give some kind of further information about the different types of space radiation. So beyond low Earth orbit, we can speak about, and we can divide radiation and space radiation into 3 main categories. The first category is the solar wind. The solar wind is composed of low energy electrons, protons, and alpha particles. This is a continuous flux of radiation of low energy, which in fact for radiation protectionists or radiation researchers like myself, this is like a low hazard. So it doesn't really, it's not such a high risk. So basically this solar wind is stopped by the space coat and the space protection, also by the spacesuit. So solar wind is not so much of a burden for the astronauts for long-term space mission. However, we know that solar particle events, when you have a solar eruption, for example, you can have a burst that can last for a day or two, which is intermittent, and which is a burst of high energy protons. And these protons can be quite damageable to the human body. This is very hazardous, and we will see later on in this presentation how astronauts can protect within the ISS, within the International Space Station. Where do they protect when these solar eruptions are taking place? And then another aspects of radiation is coming from the galactic cosmic rays, which are mainly composed of protons, or almost 90% of high energy protons, and also alpha particles, 12% of alpha particles, and also heavy ions with a high energy from hundreds of MeV to 1 giga electron volt. These are continuous flux of radiation, very high energetic, and they are hazardous. And really for missions to Mars, these are very important to take into consideration, also to develop as much as possible countermeasures. But first, so let's focus on the two aspects related to radiation, the solar wind and the solar particle events. The solar radiation. So the sun is a very turbulent object, and it emits a continuous emission of energetic charged particles that I mentioned, which are solar wind. So the solar winds are mostly protons, electrons, limited amount of nuclei, and they are of low energies, and they are usually blocked by the spacecraft. Then on top of that, we have the solar storms or the solar particle events, which are regular energetic eruptions or solar storms at the surface of the sun with extra large and extra energetic charged particles. And these solar particle events are also, their probability is proportional to the solar activity. And we'll speak about the solar activity in a minute. They are quite difficult to predict. But on the ISS, they have a limited dose contribution to the general dose encountered by the space environment. But for further and for beyond low Earth orbit, they will become a major topic and they can become a major aspects of radiation. And the sun has got an activity which is cyclic, which is an 11-year cycle. And on the surface of the sun, you have a number of spots, and these number of spots at the surface is a measure of the activity, of the solar activity. So the more solar storms originate in fact from these spots. So if you want to have a look here more into detail, you can see that the sunspots, as you can see on the right-hand side of the graph, are really kind of related to the solar activity, which I mentioned is a cycle of about 11 years. Then we have the galactic radiation, which are star explosions or supernova, which emits then a very strong electromagnetic field. And this field can really accelerate charged particles. And these are continuous flux of heavy ions, but also of highly charged particles from all directions. And these galactic radiation are really present at a much higher intensity beyond low Earth orbit. So these galactic radiation are charged particles that are accelerated by the supernovas remnants. They are mostly composed of protons and helium nuclei with a limited amount of heavier nuclei, and they have a very high energy. And their flux is also inversely proportional to the solar activity due to the shielding. And they are much easier to predict. So extrapolation and prediction are possible for this galactic radiation. And they basically encounter for about 75% of the radiation dose that astronauts are subjected to inside the International Space Station. Galactic radiation are continuous, but they are quite difficult to shield and to block, to stop, to cope inside the space station or for future mission to the moon and to Mars. So quite a lot of research is still necessary. You can see here the abundance. So mainly galactic radiation are composed of heavy ions, protons, and helium nuclei, with about 2% of electrons and positrons. And heavy ions are not so much in terms of percentage, but they are quite important in terms of damage that they induce inside the cells, because they can induce some kind of quite complex damage inside the cells. So galactic radiation here, as you can see, are also, as you can see from the rating, are also inversely proportional to the sunspots. Then we have the geomagnetic fields. The geomagnetic fields is helping us and shielding very well on the Earth, shielding largely from cosmic radiation. And only allows this shielding only allowed most energetic particles to reach the atmosphere. We know that the Earth is not equally protected and that the polar areas are less protected in comparison with the rest of the Earth. There is no significant magnetic field on the Moon or Mars. And we know also that some of the particles, some of the energetic charged particles are captured in the Van Allen radiation belts. To show you also here, you see that if you look at the equator and in comparison at the poles, that the dose of radiation is much higher at the poles than on at the equator. And that the radiation and galactic cosmic radiation also will increase with the altitude. So that's why we also receive a higher dose of radiation when we are in the mountains. The Van Allen radiation belts. I will speak about the inner radiation belts as well as the outer radiation belts. So the Van Allen radiation belts are these Earth magnetic fields that are partly shielding us from radiation from Earth, and some energetically charged particles can be trapped by the magnetic field in the bands around the Earth. This magnetic field is not, as I mentioned, not symmetrical, and because of the magnetic axis, which not goes through the center of the Earth. And that's why we see on this picture that we have a kind of a South Atlantic anomaly up to 200 kilometers above the Earth's surface, where the dose of radiation is much higher than in the rest of the Earth's surface. There is no, not this Van Allen radiation belts around, no magnetic field, sorry, around the Moon and Mars. So if you look at the radiation doses, you can see this South Atlantic anomaly with a much higher dose of radiation. So the Van Allen radiation belts with the inner belt and the outer belt, the inner belt, the center of the inner belt is about 3,000 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And this belt comes from a decay of neutrons into protons and electrons. And those neutrons come so by interaction with the atmospheres. And it's lowered, these inner belts are also lowered to 200 kilometers at the level of the South Atlantic anomaly. And the intensity is inversely proportional to the solar activity. And this inner band is quite of importance for the low Earth orbit manned flight. So, for example, on the ISS. The outer belt has got its center around 22,000 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And it's mainly filled by electrons from the sun during solar storms and with an energy which is quite low, with less than 7 MeV. The intensity and the size is proportional to the solar activity and is playing an important role for expedition exposure, like, for example, on the ISS. So 20% of radiation that the astronauts are subjected to is due to these Van Allen radiation belts when the astronauts are inside the ISS, and certainly when they passage through the South Atlantic anomaly. What does happen when cosmic radiation interacts with materials? In fact, radiation and cosmic radiation can induce the production of secondary particles and can really induce a myriad of secondary particles that can, in some cases, be even more detrimental and damageable to the cells and to the human body. So these secondary cosmic radiation, they come, in fact, from the nuclear reactions between the primary radiation and the matter. So it's very important to understand which type of matter and which type of material we should use for future missions to the moon and to Mars to avoid this production, as much as possible, production of secondary cosmic radiation. So this secondary cosmic radiation comes from and generates secondary protons, but also neutrons and nuclei, and it's a kind of an avalanche. But they also come from secondary gammas and pions that can be produced. And the secondary radiation very much depends on the material composition. So of the, for example, of the space code of a spacecraft, or like the spacesuit can also have, and the material used for the spacesuit can also induce this type of secondary radiation. And this secondary radiation can be sometimes even more dangerous than primary radiation. Here you can see some examples of this secondary radiation, which is due to interactions of primary radiation with nuclei of the spacecraft material or within the human body. And you see the type of secondary radiation that can be generated from the primary particles. Within the International Space Station, we have some kind of shielding. So if you look at the type of shielding which is tested, you have for galactic radiation inside the ISS, aluminium is tested, water, polyethylene, but liquid nitrogen really allows to have a very good protection against galactic radiation and also against Van Allen protons from generated and coming inside the ISS. So liquid nitrogen in general is one of the very best and most efficient stopper of radiation. When astronauts are encountering some high level of radiation from a solar storm or a solar particle event, for example, they can kind of protect themselves and shield in one of the three areas inside the ISS. One, as you can see, is a water wall, which is water is, as you know, the water molecule is composed of hydrogen and can efficiently stop quite a lot of these primary. Also inside the lab's sleep station, we have a good protection from polyethylene. And polyethylene is a large and a long molecule of carbon with hydrogen on each side of the carbon atom. So this polyethylene blocks quite well, due to the high presence of hydrogen, blocks quite well radiation coming from solar particle events. Usually a few minutes before the solar particle events reach the ISS, the detectors give a kind of alarm and help to give a certain number of time, just enough time for the astronauts to go to shield in one of these three part of the ISS. So these three parts are providing some extra shielding, and these are three compartments with extra shieldings. But galactic radiation remains very difficult to stop due to their very high energy. And they would require really several meters of materials and about 10 to 11 meters of water to be totally stopped. So this is not realistic for spacecrafts. It would be more realistic for habitats, stable habitats on the moon or on Mars. What is the shielding effect that we have from cosmic radiation? In our atmosphere, we have like a very, very good shielding properties of our atmosphere, where 99% of cosmic radiations are really blocked. A spacesuit would only provide like a shielding capability of about 0.1% of what the atmosphere is shielding. So not very, very good shielding. And the Apollo lunar lander was also providing only a few, not even a percent of the shielding that we would have on Earth with our atmosphere. So there is really a very important research which is needed in order to shield as much as possible habitats, future habitats on the Moon and on Mars. And we know that an underground habitat could be certainly helpful to decrease the dose of radiation. And it's also very important to study the possibilities of using regolith, but also using CO2, using also aluminium or water to have a very good shielding effects like we have on our atmosphere. I would like also to mention a few words on the spacesuit, because spacesuit as used during the Apollo mission and used for extravehicular activities were only used for a few hours, and mostly for about 3 lunar extravehicular activities by the Apollo astronauts. But for the future astronauts going back to the Moon, also going to Mars, a lot more lunar activity, extravehicular activities will be performed, which means in a very extreme and a very difficult environments with the presence of regoliths, which are very abrasive, very so attacking material, very reactive, composed of very reactive materials and dust. But also these spacesuits should be also good to protect against UV, good for temperature regulation, providing also oxygen, and a weight which should be also taken into consideration to not have a too high weight. Even if gravitational force on the Moon is a sixth of the Earth, still a heavy spacesuit would be kind of even more burden for the astronauts. We also need to consider for the spacesuit and pay attention to the walking capabilities, to have really like a spacesuit which would be flexible and elastic. So different types of materials are for the moment tested, Gore-Tex, like also Kevlar or Teflon or polycarbonate. And what are the typical doses we are talking about and the dose rates? On the Earth, we are talking about a dose of 0.1 microsievert per hour, which corresponds to about 1 millisievert over 1 year on Earth. On the International Space Station, we are talking about 100 times, 250 times higher doses than on Earth for over a period of 6 months' time. So the typical mission of an astronaut on the ISS. From the Mars surface, we are talking about 300 times higher doses for a 500 days stay on the Mars surface. So then in comparison with the Earth. And during deep space getaway and the deep space mission, then we are also talking about 300 times higher doses for a 180-day trip to Mars. So all in all, we are talking about a full mission to Mars and back of a dose which is about 1,000 times more than on Earth. So it's really it can be very damageable. For the moment, most of the research is performed on the ISS, on the International Space Station. This is where we, as scientists, we have some radiation detectors from SELGRA-ELGRA, my institute, inside, but also outside the International Space Station. This helps to characterize the dose of radiation inside and outside, the impact of material and of the spacecraft material composition. We also, for the moment on the ISS, performing different types of monitoring on the astronauts themselves before and when they come back from a space mission, and monitoring the DNA damage within the blood of the astronauts. We are also actively participating in the MELISA program, and the MELISA program is the program of life support for future mission, where we can recycle urine, feces, and rest of vegetables, for example, during the mission, and produce oxygen, produce pure and clean water, and also use fertilizer, bacteria as fertilizer for production of food. We are here on the ISS at 300, 400 kilometers from the Earth, and as I mentioned, about 150 times more doses of radiation than on the Earth. Then, if we speak about the Moon, the distance from the Earth to the Moon is about 380,000 kilometers. The Moon is the archive of the Earth history. There is no magnetic field, no atmosphere, so there is no protection from harmful effect of radiation. So it's a good platform also to understand, to test different types of equipment, different types of monitoring, and the Moon Village, the International Moon Village, in which most international space agencies are working on, which is an important project, is really an environment in which humans and robots would work together and perform different types of mining operations, but also astronomy research and other research, scientific research on the lunar surface. And then further away on Mars, you can think about a full total dose of 1,000 times what we are encountering on Earth. It's the Mars planet is the most similar planet to the Earth. It allows us to really understand whether life has existed elsewhere in the universe beyond Earth, which is a fundamental question for us as mankind, for humanity. We know that it was once full of water and warmer. It has a very, very thin atmosphere of about 1%. So it's potentially, together with the water, the most habitable environment. The distance from the Earth to Mars is about 60 million to 225 million kilometers. So irradiation, back to irradiation, between two Apollo missions, we had the Apollo 16 mission in April 72, and in December 72, we had the Apollo 17 mission. In between, we had in August 1972 a very serious solar storm. So imagine that if the astronauts had been outside doing their extravehicular activities, then as represented here on these pictures, the dose that they would have encountered would have been extremely high, and they would have most probably suffered from space radiation syndrome. So how can we quantify the cosmic radiation dose? I'm not going to enter too much into detail, but basically you can measure on a radiometric point of view, the number of particles. And then on a dosimetric point of view, you can translate this, depending on the fluence, this value into absorbed dose. And the absorbed dose then can be transformed into, together with a radiation weighting factor, into the protection dose. The dose basically that will give us, as biologists, the potential risks of deterministic effects. Deterministic effects and stochastic effects. Deterministic effects and stochastic effects are the two main bigger categories of effects that you can encounter following radiation exposure. And then we can translate it into operational effects and operational quantities of doses. From the deterministic to the stochastic effects, we also need to take into account the tissue weighting factor, because our body is composed of different tissues, different organs, and each organ will have also a particular radiation sensitivity. So it's not only that the intrinsic radiation sensitivity varies between individuals, but it also varies between the different parts of our body. So it's important to know also that radiation and tissue weighting factors are average on a body which doesn't exist, which is half a man and half a woman. So it's a kind of generic body. And it also depends on the different types of particles, different types of energy of the different radiation. Depends on the age, because the age, depending on the age, the sensitivity will vary. Operational quantities are defined for astronauts to give the most conservative estimate for astronauts. So to really that the impact on their health is as minimal as possible. But it's very complex. Cosmic radiation are very complex and not always predictable. So we always kind of extrapolate this information to the best we can. And that gives us a kind of a direct estimation of the potential risks that astronauts will encounter going to the moon or to Mars. And I would like to bring now another important fact is the importance to develop precision radiation medicine for astronauts. So we know that astronauts are exposed to different stresses in space. They are exposed to weightlessness, they're exposed to radiation, and very complex radiation that can change depending on their position, on their altitude, and on the solar activities. But on top of that, we know that astronauts are also exposed to psychological stresses due to isolation, to confinement, to the workload, and to the sleep disturbances. All these effects are important to take into consideration. On top of that, on the moon surface, you have the exposure to the dust, which is also a kind of physical stress. And if you go to Mars, you are of such a distance from the Earth, then you are confronted to another psychological stress, which is the very long distance to Mars and the fact that you don't see your beloved Earth planet anymore. And that's an extra stress. So I'm not going to go too much into detail because I'm pretty sure you know quite well as members and as interested by the importance of and the impact of the absence of this gravitational force, that it can induce quite a lot of different stresses. And important aspects are space sickness, disturbed sense of equilibrium, but also the change of liquid distribution in the body with a more concentrated lymph and blood at the upper part of the body. We also know that astronauts are confronted to a loss of muscle loss and a loss of muscle mass, and also a loss of bone mass, and therefore they really need to perform exercises and physical exercises in order to counteract this impact. We also know that astronauts are confronted to increased microbial virulence because the microbes, bacteria, viruses that are present inside astronauts' body and that are under control by the immune system can become quite virulent and can kind of wake up in space conditions. And we know that astronauts are confronted to disturbed lymphocyte function and to a weaker immune system. Between female and males, there are also differences in space conditions, with females experiencing less hearing loss, less visual impairment, or even no visual impairment, it seems. They seem to have a better immune response, but they are more sensitive to the orthostatic intolerance, and they also have more infections of the urinary tract. And we also know that between females and males, but between astronauts as well, there is a very large variability of muscle and bone loss. Radiation sensitivity decreases with age. So the lower the age, the younger the age of astronauts, the higher the risk. But so if you look on the left-hand side here, so when a person is extremely young, so the first 10 years, you see that the radiation susceptibility is much higher than when a person is reaching 50 years and older than 50 years. So basically, there is also, not in all international space agencies, but there is also a risk and a threshold of those that can't be increased, and that that is different for female astronauts and male astronauts from NASA. So the American astronauts have got a different way of looking at radiation risks, in the way that that the risk is taken into account depending on the gender, but also depending on the age. Whilst for Russian and for European astronauts, the risk is kind of the same, taken into same, not depending on the gender and not depending on the age. So as you can see, the risk depending, so you can see here the risk varying depending on the age and depending on the gender, and with as you can see also risk changing also from depending on the number of days that you could imagine. The number of days could increase the more age the astronauts are. So also important to understand that inter-individual radiation sensitivity exists. So there are astronauts that are quite resistant towards radiation. Some other astronauts are quite sensitive towards radiation. So there is an intrinsic variability. So not all humans are created equal. And like on Earth, like if you look at patients having to receive radiation therapy, some of them might have a lot of side effects from radiation due to their intrinsic radiation sensitivity, and some others might have a lot less radiation effects. So it's important in that context to understand the individualized risk, not only the generic risk due to radiation, but also the intrinsic risk per astronaut, depending on on his or her intrinsic radiation susceptibility. And therefore, there is really a need to develop biomarkers of radiation sensitivity. And this is what we do in radiation biology in my institute at the Belgian Nuclear Research Center, trying to develop biomarkers of response for radiation sensitivity. As I mentioned, radiation sensitivity varies also between organs. And you can see here a map from the European Space Agency showing the parts of the body that are the most sensitive to radiation. So you have the eyes, you have the lungs, the breast in females, the viscera, so the intestinal tract. We have the stomach as well, the pelvis that contains the bone marrow progenitors, and the genital organs. These are the parts of the body that are the most sensitive to radiation, and that would need to be best protected. So that's why there is always some kind of a jacket around the viscera and around the torso of astronauts in order to protect as much as possible for long-term missions to the Moon and to Mars. We are for the moment preparing at the level of ESA, you have a lot of experts that are preparing the next strategic planning and roadmap for cosmic radiation studies. So before it's totally published, I would like to show you the main aspects for the strategic roadmap. You have the biological effects that need to be better understood, and on the right-hand side, the physical aspects. So the biological effects show that we need to understand the radiation response of the body. We need also to understand better what are the mechanisms underlying the radiation sensitivity of astronauts. How can we better predict the radiation risks assessment, and how can we develop the best countermeasures? So this is for the biological part. And for the physical part, how can we characterize better the radiation environment? How can we develop personal dosimetry, codes for modeling radiation, and best shielding? So the cancer radiation, cancer risk also, of course, will increase towards future missions to the moon and to Mars. And if you think that at the day of today, for our population on Earth, we have a risk of developing cancer of about 25% for female and about 33% for males, for men. So if we increase this risk, like you see in this graph, for a Mars mission, this risk, of course, can vary in terms of risk, but the risk can increase from about 2% to about 20 to 30%. So which means that for female astronauts, the risk from 25% of developing naturally a cancer could increase up to 45% or even 50%. So a risk of 1 to 2 going to Mars and back. And for male astronauts is even worse, because you would go from natural risk of 33% to a risk that could go up to 50 to 60% of developing cancer. So there is really it's an important field of research to develop as much as possible countermeasures, shielding, but other processes. Biomarkers for future precision medicine of astronauts. A biomarker, let me first define it. It's any measurement which is reflecting an interaction between a biological system and the environment. And that can be a chemical, a physical, or a biological biomarker. So that will help us to, developing these biomarkers will help us to measure and to define basically the best program for each astronaut depending on their intrinsic radiation sensitivity. Biomarkers are classified into 4 different categories. You have biomarkers of exposure that are very much expressed just after radiation, and that are expressed depending on the dose of irradiation, so proportionally to the dose of irradiation. Then you have the biomarkers of susceptibility, which are basically intrinsic markers, mutations inside the body that will confer a certain radiation susceptibility to astronauts. Then you have the biomarkers of late effects that will appear years and decades after exposure. And then biomarkers of persistent effects that will also take place and start to be taking place and developed after exposure, and will become more and more prone. So biomarkers are very wide in terms of potential, but also in terms of parts of the cells where they can be found. So you can have parts that are placed on the DNA, on protein level, on the epigenetic level, on its cytogenetics, on mutation level. And my institute, SEKCN, works mainly on the categories that are represented in red in this picture. What are the potential space radiation health risks that could be encountered for astronauts going to the moon and to Mars? First, a higher risk of developing cancer. So the longer the exposure to space radiation and the higher the dose, the higher the risks to develop cancer. So the higher risk of morbidity or mortality. Higher risk also to develop acute and late central nervous system effects. So also a higher risk of developing cardiovascular diseases and other degenerative tissue effects like cataract, or like aging related diseases, or like respiratory or immune dysfunction. And then in case of solar particle events, very high doses of irradiation, there is a risk also of developing the acute radiation syndrome. And the acute radiation syndrome is composed of different types of symptoms like nausea, vomiting, anorexia, or fatigue, or skin reddening, or the depletion of bone marrow and of blood forming organs. So, but because only moderate doses of radiation are encountered, these effects aren't usually observed in astronauts. But If we speak about much longer missions to Mars, so it could happen in some cases that dose of irradiation could become much higher and could induce some acute radiation syndrome. There is a very important matter also of understanding even more how space radiation interact with the cells, because they interact at a very complex and induce very complex biological effects. Galactic cosmic rays are qualitatively very different than the rays and the radiations that we are using on Earth, for example, for radiotherapy or for radiography, like X-rays or gamma rays. So we can't really extrapolate directly what we see with X-rays and gamma rays to what will happen with space radiation. So it's really important to also study galactic cosmic rays themselves, because they induce densely ionizing irradiation and ionization along the particle track. And that induces, as you can see on the right-hand side of this picture, very dense and very complex DNA damage to repair. And this complex DNA damage could induce some distinct patterns of repair length than we know on Earth and with the radiation that we know from Earth. So it's important to further investigate because the biological effects and health risks can be different from what we know on Earth from X-ray and gamma rays. And of course, we don't have any human data that exists of astronauts going to Mars yet, because we've not had astronauts going to Mars. So we don't have data yet. So that's so animal models, cellular models with simulated space radiation are very important to gain information into and scientific knowledge in this endeavor. And also that there is a potential risks that microgravity, for example, together with lunar dust and other stresses, have a synergistic impact on the risks for future spaceflight factors. So there are different ways to improve radiation resistance of astronauts. For example, enhanced shielding, medical selection of the most radiation resistant individuals, developing radiation protectors, but also developing biomarkers, as I mentioned, but also decreasing the metabolisms of astronauts through hibernation, for example, that could induce a better radiation response and better radiation resistance. And also developing regenerative technologies and biobanking, which is also a line of research that we have currently developed at my institute at SEKCN. And I'm also pleased to see that one of our PhD students currently following this presentation is working, in fact, on mini organ, on organoid, and developing future heart, a small heart, for future regenerative medicine possibilities for astronauts. So in conclusion, it's very important to continue to develop a better risk assessment for deep space exploration, to have more insights into the possible interaction effects of spaceflight stressors, of synergistic, antagonist, or additive effects of the different stressors, and to understand and to reveal the altered cellular functioning, and to indicate also, to have more indication for possible countermeasure development. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I will answer to any questions you would be interested to ask me. Thank you again.
Well, thank you very much for this awesome presentation. I think we have a few questions in the chat, so I'm going to read them. And also, if you do have one, just open your mic and ask away. So the first question was, what about interstellar space medium, dose of radiation there?
Okay, so interstellar, we have some data, but I would compare them. I'm just looking for now. I would personally compare them to right now to the deep space information that I mentioned. So I would say that it's roughly about 300 to 500 times higher doses than what we encounter on Earth. And we have some data, but also some kind of a partial data, but they would certainly not be less than the deep space. It could only be, I think, even higher doses. We are not talking yet so much on interstellar activities and human missions. So that's something which is probably going to come, but much later. And I think by the time we would more consider that, I really do hope and expect that we would have developed also the necessary countermeasure to really block even more and to have a better shielding of interstellar radiation.
Okay, another question is how to overcome space radiation. Is there any radio protection suits available to protect the astronauts?
So you have, for the moment, the best suits that are available are in fact suits that are containing polyethylene. So if you look at jackets that are used for the Artemis program, these jackets are only protecting the torso, so the upper part of the body, and they are very dense polyethylene. And polyethylene, as I mentioned, is carbon with some hydrogen bonds on each side of the carbon atom. So very highly concentrated on with hydrogen, and hydrogen is very good at stopping. So I would say molecules containing a lot of hydrogen, helium could be also a possible, boron. So really atoms that are the smallest atoms of the Mendeleev table, of the periodic table, would be the most interesting. There are quite a lot of studies also on boron, on nanoparticles of boron that are taking place, as far as I know, mainly from the NASA side, mainly in America, and not so much in Europe. And Europe, I would say, is still focusing a lot on polyethylene and hydrogen bond molecules.
Now the question is, how different is cosmic radiation from regular Earth radiation?
Yes, on the Earth, so I mentioned we really have very little heavy ion. We have a lot of ultraviolet radiation that are stopped by our atmosphere, by our ozone layers. If we didn't have the ozone layers, we would have we would not be able to survive, because the ultraviolet exposure would be so intense. So these are the ultraviolet are stopped by our atmosphere. They are also stopped. The ultraviolets are also very well stopped by the spacecraft, so they are not so much of an issue. But they could be more an issue for extravehicular activities on the Moon or on Mars. So, and you have very little of the heavy ion, very little of proton irradiation, and almost no high energetic particles. So you have so you have 99.9% of space radiation, which is blocked on Earth.
Nice. Does anyone else have a question? I have one. So since the 70s, I guess we made a lot of progress suit-wise. Looking back, do you know if they were really aware of how dangerous it was to do EVAs on the Moon during the Apollo missions, and how long did those EVA last?
So the EVA lasted usually about 2 hours, 2-3 hours. If you look, the main EVAs were quite short. So even if they were aware of radiation, I mean, they were aware of the Van Allen belts, but it was yeah, the data, the information was not as developed as we know now. They were more surprised of the lunar dust and the damage of the lunar dust. And they were more, in fact, concerned about the lunar dust impact. So some astronauts from the Apollo program were complaining about the fact that this lunar dust was really was coming everywhere, also inside the lamp, and was very irritating for the eyes, very irritating for the lungs. Some astronauts really suffered at the level of the lungs and the level of the eyes. But for radiation, the dose of radiation and also the length of the mission was quite short finally, and so the exposure was all in all very short. So there was no real effects on the Apollo for the health in terms, but more for lunar dust.
That's good to hear. We have other questions in the chat. Where can we further learn about this subject? Any open of resource you can suggest?
Yes, so there are quite a lot of information on PubMed. So if you look on PubMed on articles, and if you type space radiation, cosmic radiation, of course you will find quite a lot of information. I'm also very happy to say that we are finalizing now a textbook, a radiobiology textbook, and your vice president, Eline Hatztak, is one of the contributors, as well as Emil Renberg to this, and Silvana Miranda. I see that they are all three present, have been contributing to in particular to the space radiation biology. So it will be published before the end of this year. So I would really invite you to get access to this book. This book will be freely available for anyone, for everyone. So please have a look at this book. It's going to be a few months before it's published, but the book will be published before the end of this year. There are also some interesting talks on TEDx and TED Talks that I would invite you also to listen to. Radiation is a fascinating field. Very interesting field. We still don't know everything. We are still needing more research. But I would say that the main sources are scientific articles. You can also contact me or contact Eline Hatztak from the SELGRA board, and she will certainly also relay the information and the questions to us. So you can definitely contact us for more information if you need.
Nice. There's another question. Is there any radio protection drugs available?
The most radiation protection drugs that are available are coming mainly from the radiotherapy field. So there are substances that are given to patients to decrease the risks of effect and due to radiation therapy of side effects. So mainly you can imagine to have these substances as a gel on the surface of the skin, because the red skin is one of the effects, one of the first effects that patients encountering radiation therapy might develop. You have quite a lot of radiation protectors are usually antioxidants. So these are substances, molecules that are kind of avoiding reactive oxygen species to be produced, or kind of inducing the fact that they would not be as corrosive for the cells, for inside the cells. So very often you use antioxidants, or a combination of different antioxidants, or different concentration, or different molecules. But I would say there are quite a lot of radiation protectors. Nature has developed a lot of protectants inside different types of plants that are able to be protected against UV radiation. So quite a lot are already present naturally, and then some others are being tested for radiotherapy purposes and for protection. And but right now we don't have the best one to be given without any single side effects for long term. But ideally, we are testing some, and ideally, I would say that radiation protectors would be best to be given maybe just before an extravehicular activity, before the astronauts are going out, being exposed to just with the spacesuit, without being protected by the space habitat, by the moon habitat or Mars habitat. I would say that they would not need to, maybe not needed to be given all the time, but would need to boost immune system, boost antioxidant activities, and would be given. And that's why we work a lot in terms of precision medicine, personalized medicine for astronauts, to be able to give and to prescribe, to give at the right moment, not necessarily all the time, but maybe more when they are in the deep space, more when they are just with the spacesuit. That would be more at risk. The astronauts would be more at risk at those periods of time.
Nice. Any other question? No.
I also have a question, if no one else has a question. You mentioned the use of biomarkers, and I was just wondering, in future, how can we use these biomarkers? Will they be used in selection of astronauts for future astronaut candidates, or how can we use this?
A very important question, in fact, because the idea is not to use them for the selection of astronauts. It's not to select out an astronaut. So from the moment an astronaut is selected, the idea of these biomarkers would be to develop their personal program of exposure to radiation. So for example, typical example, if you have an astronaut selected, but where you can see that this person might be quite susceptible to radiation, to maybe not send these astronauts to the most dangerous space mission with the highest level of exposure, but to maybe limit maybe the extravehicular activities or the time these astronauts would stay outside the moon, to maybe more do some activities inside the habitat, you see? So the personalized program would be, could be helped through knowing this intrinsic radiation sensitivity, but not to select out an astronaut or to select in an astronaut.
That's really interesting. If there's no other question, I would like to thank you again for coming and talk about radiation. It was really interesting. Again, for the others, we will make sure that this recording will be available on our YouTube channel. There's a link in the chat currently. You can follow us on social media. You can become a member of SELGRA if you want to know more about our future events. And well, I will see you guys during our next webinar, and hopefully in Lisbon for the ELGRA Symposium.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely end of the day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.